The storm hit harder than anything Ethan Cole had ever faced. Out here, in the frozen heart of Montana, nature wasn't his enemy. Silence was. His dog, Scout, started acting strange, scratching, whining, staring at the old stone fireplace as if something alive was buried beneath it. Ethan had seen that look before. In war, seconds before everything exploded. Only this time, the danger wasn't under sand. It was right beneath his floor. What they were about to uncover had been hidden for 15 years by men powerful enough to bury the truth, and anyone who dared to find it. Wind howls, fire crackles. A war veteran found peace in a $500 cabin until his dog revealed what should have stayed buried. The wind over western Montana carried a voice that could freeze a man's soul. It howled across the Bitterroot Mountains, dragging with it waves of snow that swallowed the trees whole. The road ahead was nothing but a pale, shifting blur, and the old Ford pickup groaned as it climbed higher into the wilderness. Inside, Ethan Cole gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes locked on the faint shape of a wooden sign half buried in snow, Raven's Ridge Trail. It was barely readable, but it told him he was close. The truck heater wheezed weakly. Frost crept across the inside of the windshield, spreading in fragile veins. Ethan leaned closer to the wheel, his breath misting against the glass. He'd driven hundreds of miles across the state to reach this forgotten patch of land, and now the storm had turned the world into a white coffin. But he didn't mind. He'd known worse weather. Worse silence. On the passenger seat, Scout lifted his head. A 7-year-old German shepherd with a coat of steel gray fur and amber eyes sharp enough to cut the dark. His build was solid but agile, the kind of body that still remembered its training. A thin scar ran along his muzzle, a reminder of the explosion that had ended his service career and nearly Ethan's life as well. Scout had been trained to detect bombs, track blood, and stay calm through chaos. But even now, retired, he still sat like a soldier awaiting orders. Ethan glanced over, a faint smile tugging at his stubbled face. "Almost there, partner." Scout gave a low whuff, his tail thumping once against the seat. At 42, Ethan looked like a man carved from the same rough timber that surrounded him. Tall, lean, weathered by wind and time. His dark brown hair was streaked with silver, his beard trimmed short, and a faded scar cut through his left eyebrow. The years had marked him, but not broken him. His eyes, clear and cold blue, were eyes that had once looked at war without blinking. They had seen smoke, loss, and men he couldn't save. He had left the Marines 8 years ago, after a roadside blast in Kandahar shattered his leg and took half his platoon. He healed, at least on paper. His body did. His mind didn't. Then came the accident. His wife, Anna, killed in a winter crash on a road not unlike this one. He'd sold everything afterward: the house, the furniture, the memories. He just wanted silence, the kind you only find at the edge of nowhere. When the county clerk in Flathead had mentioned a foreclosed cabin listed for $500, Ethan hadn't thought twice. "It's out near Raven's Ridge," the woman had said. "Old logging land, been empty 15 years. Perfect. Now, as the truck's tires crunched onto the snow-packed trail, the headlights cut through the swirling flurries and found it. The cabin. It sat alone at the edge of a clearing, a squat structure of blackened logs and a roof bent beneath the weight of snow. The stone chimney rose tall and crooked, its surface mottled with moss and soot. It looked less like a home, and more like something the forest had forgotten to reclaim. Ethan killed the engine. The silence that followed was immense. He sat for a moment, listening to the wind batter the truck's frame before exhaling slowly. "We're home, boy." Scout leapt down first, landing softly in the snow. His breath steamed in the cold. He looked around, ears high, tail low, a soldier assessing new ground. Ethan followed, boots sinking deep. The air smelled of pine and old ice, the kind of smell that belonged to a world untouched by time. The front porch groaned as they stepped up. Ethan pushed the door open. The hinges shrieked like something waking from a long sleep. Inside, the air was dense with dust, and the faint, sweet rot of wood left too long alone. His flashlight swept across the room. One bed frame, a table, 2 chairs, and a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. Cobwebs hung from the rafters. The floorboards creaked under his weight, complaining about the intrusion. Still, it was better than a tent, better than a motel filled with noise and strangers. Ethan dropped his duffel bag on the table and rubbed his hands together. "Not bad for $500. Scout sniffed his way around the room, nose tracing every edge, every shadow. His nails clicked lightly against the boards. When he reached the fireplace, he stopped. His head tilted slightly. His ears pricked forward. Ethan noticed. "Find something?" The dog didn't move. He lowered his nose to the stone hearth, inhaled, then let out a low, uncertain growl. Not anger. Something else. Confusion. Ethan crouched beside him, running his palm across the cool surface of the stone. It was just rock, smooth and cold, maybe slick with soot. But Scout's attention didn't waver. He began to paw gently, claws scraping faintly. "Easy," Ethan said. "It's just a fireplace." But Scout ignored him, whining softly now. He circled the hearth once, then sat down, staring at it. Ethan watched for a moment, then straightened and unpacked his gear. He found a lantern, a pack of matches, and a small tin of instant coffee. The lantern's light glowed warm, golden against the cold gray interior. He filled the silence with small motions, setting his thermos on the table, checking the rifle he'd brought from the truck, hanging his coat by the door. Outside, the storm thickened. Wind hammered the walls and dragged icy fingers through the cracks. The cabin shuddered but held. Ethan built a fire in the hearth. Small at first, then growing until the logs caught with a crackle. The light filled the room, chasing back the shadows. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. He pulled up a chair near the fire and poured coffee into a tin mug. Scout lay down beside him, head resting on his paws but eyes still open, reflecting the flames. "Relax," Ethan muttered, stroking his fur. "No one's here but us." Scout's ears flicked, but his gaze stayed locked on the base of the fireplace. Ethan leaned back, staring into the fire. The orange glow painted his face in shades of amber and shadow. His thoughts drifted. He remembered the desert heat, the metallic taste of dust in his mouth, the sound of rotors fading into distance. And then the crash, the twisted metal of his wife's car, the snow like confetti falling on sirens. He shut his eyes. The past had a way of finding new shapes. The wind howled harder, pressing against the window panes. The cabin groaned again, a low, human-sounding noise that made him glance toward the ceiling. A loose shutter clattered outside. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Scout rose suddenly, his body tense. The dog stared at the hearth again, tail stiff, every muscle coiled. Then came the sound. A soft, almost imperceptible click. Ethan frowned. "What the hell?" He set down the mug and knelt beside Scout. The dog's nose was pressed against one of the larger stones near the center of the hearth. It looked slightly different, smoother, maybe newer. Ethan brushed away soot along the edges. There was a thin line there, almost invisible, running around the stone's outline. "Some kind of repair," he muttered. He tapped it lightly with his knuckle. The sound was wrong. Not solid, but hollow, faintly metallic. Scout let out a low growl. Ethan sat back on his heels, thinking. He'd spent years learning to trust that sound. It wasn't fear. It was warning. He stood slowly, walked to the window, and looked out. The forest beyond was nothing but white blur and black trunks bending under snow. No movement. No light. Just the storm. He turned back toward the fire. "All right," he whispered. "Tomorrow we'll see what you're trying to tell me." He tossed another log into the flames, then rolled out his sleeping bag near the hearth. Scout settled close beside him, his warmth familiar, grounding. The firelight flickered over the walls, catching the worn surface of a framed photograph Ethan had placed on the table. A younger man in uniform, arm around a woman with sunlight in her hair. Her name was Anna. He didn't look at it long. The night deepened. The wind screamed through the chimney, carrying the voice of something ancient and restless. The fire dimmed to embers. Scout's breathing slowed, but his ears stayed up, listening. Ethan lay awake for a long time, eyes on the cracked ceiling, mind empty except for the rhythm of the storm. Eventually, exhaustion won. He drifted into uneasy sleep, the kind that never reaches peace. Outside, the snow thickened. The cabin was nearly buried by morning, a dark shape in a world of white. Beneath the floor, under the cold stone that Scout had pawed, something waited, silent, sealed, and forgotten. It had been buried for 15 years, and by coming here, Ethan had just woken it up. Morning came without sunlight. The storm had passed, but it left behind a world smothered in white. The forest around Raven's Ridge lay buried under a heavy silence, the kind that didn't feel peaceful, just watchful. Ethan Cole opened his eyes to the faint orange glow of dying embers. The fire had burned down to ash, and the cold had crept back into the cabin. For a moment, he thought the scratching sound he heard was wind dragging branches against the wall. Then he realized it came from inside. Scout was at it again. The German shepherd's paws worked at the base of the fireplace, claws clicking against stone. His tail stood stiff, his nose pressed low, snuffling with a mix of curiosity and purpose. Ethan rubbed a hand over his face, the stubble scratching against his palm. "You've been at that all night?" he muttered. Scout paused long enough to glance back at him, amber eyes sharp and questioning, then returned to the same spot. The exact same stone. Ethan sighed. "All right, soldier. Let's see what you're trying to tell me." He knelt beside the hearth, brushing aside cold ash. His fingertips found the same smooth edge from the night before. He ran the beam of his flashlight across the base. The mortar lines stood out darker, more deliberate than the others. It wasn't just a repair. Someone had sealed it. He pressed his ear closer. No sound. No draft. Just the faint old smell of soot and earth. He fetched his utility knife and scraped carefully along the edges. The thin crust of cement flaked away like brittle ice. A small cloud of gray dust drifted upward. Scout leaned closer, his nose twitching. "Easy," Ethan warned. He wedged the blade deeper, prying until a hairline crack appeared. The stone shifted, barely, but enough for his pulse to quicken. He switched tools, pulling a short pry bar from his kit. The steel groaned against the rock. Then, with a reluctant sigh, the stone lifted free. A rush of cold air escaped from the hollow beneath. It wasn't deep, maybe 2 feet down, but perfectly cut, lined with old bricks. Inside lay a rectangular metal box, army green, scarred with rust and age. Ethan's breath fogged the air. He reached in and lifted it carefully. The box was heavier than it looked. "Looks like somebody left us a present," he said quietly. He set it on the table and brushed away the dust. The latch was stiff, but not locked. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed cloth, were several glass vials sealed with wax. Each held murky liquid, some clear, some tinted brown or black, and all labeled in neat handwriting. Sample A1, Bitterroot Stream; Sample D4, Marsh Point Well; Sample G9, Ravens Creek. The dates ranged from 15 to 16 years ago. Beneath them lay a folded map, edges brittle, and a leather-bound notebook whose cover had darkened with time. Ethan flipped the first page. Written in fine cursive ink were the words, "Property of Arthur Mason. Investigative. Correspondent, do not destroy." He frowned. The name felt familiar. He'd heard it once, maybe during a late-night radio story years ago. Something about a journalist who went missing while reporting on corporate pollution in the northern valleys. It had been one of those stories that vanish from the airwaves after a few days, replaced by something louder and easier to forget. Scout rested his head against Ethan's knee, watching as he turned the pages. The handwriting was tight, precise. Mason had written like a man who measured every word. The early entries were dated 2008. They spoke of small towns, interviews with locals, strange illnesses among livestock, streams that smelled faintly of oil. He mentioned Silver Ridge Minerals, the mining company that had been expanding into Montana back then. Ethan flipped forward. The tone shifted. The sentences grew sharper. The handwriting slanted with urgency. "They are burying the evidence under our feet. I've collected water samples, arsenic, lead, solvents, levels impossible to dismiss. But no one will publish without official confirmation. County inspectors ignore my calls. The sheriff said I should drop it. He knows more than he admits." Ethan stopped reading. Sheriff. The word tugged at a memory from yesterday at the courthouse, the deputy who'd sold him the deed. Sheriff Amos Rigby. Stocky, mid-50s, friendly handshake that didn't reach his eyes. Rigby had joked about the land being cursed. Maybe that wasn't a joke after all. He read the next page. "I'm being followed. A black truck parked outside 2 nights in a row. The phone clicks when I call the county clerk. If I disappear, tell them to check the well behind the Mason property. Tell them to test the water. Tell them they're poisoning the valley." At the bottom of the page, the last words were scrawled hastily, almost illegible. "If you find this, they got me." Ethan sat back, silent. The wind had calmed, but the cabin felt colder. Scout whined softly, sensing his unease. He ran a hand down the dog's back, grounding himself. The evidence was real. Mason's samples, the journal, the map. If the man's suspicions were true, the mining company had been dumping toxins into the water for years, covering it up with local officials' help. "Jesus, Mason," Ethan whispered. "You dug too deep." He turned the map over. Red circles marked several areas around Bitterroot Valley, connected by thin pencil lines. One circle sat right where his cabin stood. Next to it, a note read, "Well access sealed. Verify." He folded the papers, his jaw tight. The same company Mason had investigated, the same one mentioned in his notes, had changed names over the years. Ethan remembered hearing about its latest rebranding. Blackwell Resources, led by a man named Henry Blackwell. The name fit. The kind of man who smiled with perfect teeth while buying his way through laws. Ethan snapped the box shut. I didn't know why this evidence had been hidden in his cabin, but he did know what it meant. The cabin hadn't been abandoned by chance. Someone had sealed Mason's work away, buried it like a sin, and walked off believing time would erase it. Scout shifted, tail brushing his leg. The dog's eyes were fixed on the window. Ethan turned and saw fresh tracks outside, faint but unmistakable. Tire prints cutting through new snow, leading up the trail and disappearing into the trees. He hadn't heard a vehicle all morning. He moved to the window, wiping the glass with his sleeve. The forest beyond looked motionless, yet the tracks were recent, maybe an hour old. He caught a flicker of movement between the pines, a shadow or maybe just a trick of light. His hand went to the pistol on the table, the old Marine reflex kicking in. He waited. Nothing. Still, his instincts hummed. He packed the vials and notebook back into the box and slid it beneath the floorboards, under a loose plank near the table. Scout followed his every move, tail low. "Stay close," Ethan said softly. By afternoon, the clouds began to break, revealing streaks of pale blue sky. Ethan decided to head into town for supplies and questions. He needed to confirm what he'd found, maybe get someone to talk. He loaded the truck, locking the cabin behind him. The drive down the mountain was slow, the tires crunching through ice and half-melted snow. Abernathy's general store sat at the edge of town, a squat building with a porch sagging under icicles. A hand-painted sign creaked in the wind. Inside, the place smelled of leather, sawdust, and coffee grounds. The man behind the counter looked to be in his 70s, thin, stooped, with a white beard, and eyes that still carried a spark. "Afternoon?" the man said as the doorbell chimed. "You must be the fellow who bought the Miller. I mean the old cabin up on Raven's Ridge." "That's me," Ethan replied, brushing snow from his jacket. "Name's Harold Abernathy," the man said, offering a calloused hand. His grip was firm, despite his age. "Been running this place longer than I care to count. Folks thought no one would ever buy that property." "Why's that?" Abernathy hesitated, eyes drifting towards the window. "Let's just say that house has a history. Belonged to a journalist, fellow named Arthur Mason. Smart man, polite, used to come by here for coffee beans and ink pens. Then one day, he just vanished. Sheriff said he left town, but I never believed that." Ethan studied the old man's face. There was no deceit there, just the weary look of someone who'd seen too much and been forced to stay quiet. Abernathy lowered his voice. "People say the land's cursed. I say it's the men who cursed it." Ethan nodded slowly, paying for his supplies. As he turned to leave, Abernathy called after him. "You take care up there, son. Some things don't like being dug up." Outside, the wind picked up again, sweeping snow across the empty road. Ethan opened the truck door and looked back toward the mountains. Scout sat upright in the passenger seat, ears pricked, staring into the distance. "Yeah," Ethan murmured. "I got that feeling too." He climbed in, started the engine, and began the long drive back up the ridge, unaware that somewhere among the trees, a black SUV had already parked with its engine off, watching. The next morning broke gray and brittle. The storm clouds had thinned, leaving behind a sky the color of gunmetal and a world muffled under new snow. The air was sharp enough to sting the lungs, but the silence felt heavier than the cold. Ethan Cole stood outside the cabin with a hatchet in hand, splitting logs into smaller pieces for the fire. Each swing echoed across the frozen clearing, clean and rhythmic, the kind of motion that kept his mind from drifting back to darker memories. Scout patrolled the perimeter, leaving neat paw prints in the snow, his nose twitching at the wind. The German shepherd moved with purpose, 7 years old, but still as disciplined as the day he'd left active duty. His coat caught the morning light, dark gray fading into tan along his shoulders, and when he stopped, he stood like a statue carved out of loyalty itself. By the time Ethan stacked the wood against the porch wall, he noticed a faint hum in the distance. Not wind, an engine. He wiped his hands on his jacket and glanced toward the tree line. The noise grew louder, closer. Scout froze, ears erect, gaze locked on the narrow trail that wound up from the valley road. Moments later, a black SUV rolled into view, its tires crunching through the snow. The vehicle was spotless despite the mud and slush. Government grade or money grade, Ethan thought. Either way, not the kind that belonged this deep in the mountains. He reached instinctively for the sidearm holstered under his coat, not drawing it, just resting a hand there. The SUV stopped in front of the cabin, engine idling. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then the driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He looked out of place, like a businessman who'd taken a wrong turn into a ghost town. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in his early 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a trimmed beard that framed a strong jaw. His long wool coat was charcoal gray, tailored and expensive, the kind worn by men who never worried about weather. His black leather gloves gleamed faintly when he removed his sunglasses, revealing pale eyes, icy blue, calculating. "Morning," the man said, his voice calm, smooth. "Name's Henry Blackwell. I believe you're the new owner of this property." Ethan nodded once but didn't step forward. "That's right." Blackwell smiled in a way that showed his teeth but not warmth. "Quite a place you've got here. Remote, peaceful." He glanced around, as if inspecting an investment rather than appreciating a view. "I used to hunt up this way, years ago. Land's been in dispute off and on. Surprised to hear someone bought it." "It was on auction," Ethan said. "I had the paperwork cleared through the county." "Oh, I'm sure you did." Blackwell's tone stayed light, conversational. He took a slow step toward the porch, his boots leaving deep prints. "Still, I'd hate for there to be any misunderstanding about ownership. See, my company, Silver Ridge Minerals, we've been operating not far from here. We handle most of the old mining claims. This property sits right on the border of some of our holdings." Ethan didn't answer. He'd heard the name before. It was the same company mentioned in Arthur Mason's notebook, the one tied to the contamination reports, the missing man. The thought made the muscles in his neck tighten. Blackwell studied him, as if weighing the silence. "I'll be honest, Mr. Cole. I represent parties who'd be very interested in acquiring this place. Sentimental value, nothing more. I could offer you—" He paused, sliding his hand into his coat pocket and pulling out a folded envelope. $50,000. Cash. No questions, no delays. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "For a cabin worth $500? Blackwell chuckled softly. "Value's subjective. Wouldn't you agree?" Scout growled low in his throat, stepping between Ethan and the stranger. His fur bristled, breath steaming in the cold. Blackwell's eyes flicked down to the dog with faint distaste. "Beautiful animal," he said evenly. "But maybe you should keep him calm. Dogs pick up tension." Ethan's voice stayed steady. "He's calm when I am." The two men stood facing each other, the war veteran and the businessman, separated by a few feet of frozen air that felt heavier by the second. Blackwell's smile faded just slightly. "You're a soldier, aren't you?" "Was." "Right, of course. You strike me as the type who values order." Blackwell tucked the envelope back into his pocket. "Well, order's exactly what I'm trying to maintain out here. You see, people like you come and go. But this land has history. There are things better left undisturbed." Ethan didn't blink. "You mean buried?" Blackwell's eyes narrowed, the faintest sign of surprise flickering before the smile returned. "Interesting choice of words." He turned, glancing toward the tree line as if to admire it. "Think about the offer, Mr. Cole. $50,000 could buy you a warmer winter somewhere far away from here." He started back towards the SUV. The driver, A young man in a black parka, clean-cut, maybe ex-military, opened the door for him. Before getting in, Blackwell looked over his shoulder. "Take my advice. Some secrets in these mountains are best left in the dark." The SUV reversed slowly, then rolled down the trail until it disappeared among the trees. The sound faded, leaving only the hiss of wind through branches. Ethan stood motionless, jaw set, eyes fixed on the vanishing tracks. He didn't move until Scout whined beside him. "Yeah," he muttered. "I didn't like him either." Inside the cabin, he poured himself black coffee, pacing in front of the fireplace. The metal box still sat hidden beneath the floorboards, its weight pressing on his thoughts like a secret begging to breathe. He stared at the fire, remembering Blackwell's tone, smooth but heavy with something darker. That man hadn't come to make an offer. He'd come to make a warning. Hours later, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ethan stepped outside to lock up his tools. The temperature had dropped again. Frost crept along the edges of the porch railing. The forest was still, the kind of stillness that comes before something breaks it. Scout trotted ahead of him, tail wagging lazily, until he stopped dead. The dog's body stiffened, nose pointing toward the truck. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice low. Scout barked once, sharp and urgent. Ethan hurried over. The front tire on the driver's side was sagging, flat. He crouched, running a gloved hand along the rubber. The cut was clean, deep, deliberate. A knife, not debris. He looked toward the road again. The SUV's tracks were half covered with snow now, fading into twilight, but they led exactly where this slice of rubber told him to look. His chest tightened, the old soldier's instincts snapping into place. He rose slowly, scanning the tree line. The forest gave nothing back but silence. Scout stayed at his heel, tail low, muscles ready. Ethan whispered, "They're not buying anything. They're warning me off." He exhaled, slow and steady, forcing his mind to stillness. Panic was the enemy. Caution was survival. He checked the cabin's locks, double-bolted the door, and set the rifle beside the window before dousing the lantern. The night outside deepened, heavy with unspoken threats. From his seat by the window, Ethan watched the faint glow of the horizon fade into black. He thought about Arthur Mason, the missing journalist whose last words warned about poisoned land. Maybe this was how they silenced him. Smiles first, knives later. Scout lay at his feet, head on his paws, eyes glinting in the dim firelight. Ethan reached down, resting his hand on the dog's back. "We're not leaving," he murmured. "Not yet." The cabin creaked softly, as if it too was holding its breath. Outside, somewhere beyond the pines, a raven called once, sharp and hollow, before the sound was swallowed by the cold. The wind began as a whisper through the trees and grew into a roar that shook the mountain. By nightfall, Raven's Ridge had vanished beneath a wall of white. The blizzard came hard and fast, devouring the sky, the forest, and the road below. Ethan Cole stood by the window of his cabin, watching snow swirl in violent spirals. The world outside had turned to static. White noise made flesh. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth cracked and flared, throwing long shadows across the wooden walls. Scout lay close to the warmth, his body tense, ears twitching with every creak. The German shepherd had been uneasy since sunset, pacing, then lying down, then pacing again. He wasn't afraid of storms. He was afraid of what might be moving inside them. Ethan added another log to the fire and checked the bolt on the door for the third time. The old Marine in him had learned to respect patterns. Dogs didn't grow restless for no reason. The flat tire earlier that day still gnawed at his thoughts. Someone had come this far up the ridge and had no problem sending a message. Maybe they were still out there, waiting for the right time. He poured coffee into a tin mug and sat down at the table, the metal box with Arthur Mason's evidence still hidden beneath the floorboards. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm, and the wind screamed through the chimney like a living thing. Scout lifted his head, eyes glowing amber in the firelight. His ears locked onto the back of the cabin, the service door that led out toward the shed. A low growl rolled from his chest. Ethan froze. "What is it?" The dog rose, silent now, tail rigid. The growl deepened, vibrating through the floor. Ethan set the mug down, grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall, and moved toward the door. He killed the lantern to let his eyes adjust. Only the fire burned now, its orange light flickering across the window panes. Then came the sound, a faint metallic rattle. Someone was testing the latch. Ethan's breath slowed, controlled. He flicked the safety off the rifle and waited. The rattle stopped. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but the hiss of snow outside. Then, the door handle jerked hard, once, twice. Scout snarled, the sound raw and deep. Ethan raised the barrel toward the door. "I don't know who you are," he said evenly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline rushing in his chest. "But you're about to make a bad mistake." The handle twisted again. Ethan fired once, the muzzle flash lighting the room in a burst of orange. The shot tore through the wood and into the storm. Silence swallowed the echo. Then he heard it. The crunch of boots retreating through snow, fast and uneven. Scout lunged toward the door, barking in controlled bursts, his training clear even through instinct. Ethan threw on his coat and yanked the door open, wind and snow blasting into his face. He aimed the rifle toward the tree line, but the storm had erased everything. Still, in the halo of his flashlight, he caught a trail of footprints leading away. Heavy, deliberate, human. The tracks vanished into the blizzard, but something small glinted in the snow near the steps. He bent down and picked it up. A silver badge, triangular, worn smooth on the edges. Etched in the center was a symbol, 3 intersecting lines forming a broken mountain. Scout stood beside him, hackles raised, growling low. Ethan turned the badge in his gloved hand. "You recognize that?" he murmured. "Yeah, me neither." He pocketed it and backed inside, shutting the door tight. The latch looked bent but intact. He wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. For the next hour, he stayed awake, listening. The wind howled, but no more footsteps came. When the fire dimmed, he fed it, never letting the room go dark. Scout finally lay down, still alert, eyes on the door. Near midnight, a faint noise broke the storm's rhythm. A knock. 3 slow, deliberate taps on the front door. Ethan's heart hammered once, then steadied. He moved silently to the window, parting the curtain just enough to see outside. The porch light was off, but the snow reflected enough of the fire's glow to make out a shape. A man. He stood still, half buried in snow, shoulders hunched beneath a dark coat. Ethan tightened his grip on the rifle and called out, "You're on private property." The man didn't move. Scout growled again, louder this time. Ethan stepped closer, raising his voice. "Say what you came for." The figure lifted a hand, gloved, trembling slightly. "Please," a voice called out, hoarse, broken by wind. "Don't shoot, I'm lost." Ethan hesitated. The tone didn't sound like Blackwell's men. Too desperate, too raw. Still, his instincts warned him to stay cautious. He cracked the door an inch, keeping the rifle aimed low but ready. The man stumbled forward, face pale under a layer of frost, snow clinging to his eyelashes. He looked about 30, with messy blonde hair plastered to his forehead and days of stubble shadowing his jaw. His coat was worn, the collar torn, and his fingers red from cold. Ethan motioned with the barrel. Hands where I can see them." The stranger obeyed, lifting his hands weakly. "Car broke down. I followed the road till I saw light. I'm freezing." Scout sniffed the air, circling the man, cautious but not aggressive. Ethan lowered the rifle slightly. "Get inside before you die out there." The man collapsed just inside the door, shaking uncontrollably. Ethan shut the door fast, then tossed a blanket from the cot. "Sit by the fire." The stranger obeyed, collapsing onto the floor near the hearth. Scout sat nearby, watching every move. Ethan poured coffee into a spare cup and handed it over. "You picked a hell of a night to go sightseeing?" "Didn't plan to," the man said between shivers. "Name's Caleb Wright. I was heading toward Kalispell, took the wrong turn near the ridge. My truck's stuck in a ditch." Ethan studied him closely. Caleb looked young, but carried exhaustion deeper than simple cold. His eyes were light green, unfocused from fatigue but steady when they met Ethan's. "You're lucky you made it this far," Ethan said. Caleb gave a small nod, clutching the cup. "Storm came faster than they said. Thought I'd die out there." As the warmth returned to his face, Ethan noticed faint bruises along his temple. Fresh, narrow marks like the butt of a weapon. "You get those from your truck accident?" he asked. Caleb hesitated. "Something like that." Ethan didn't push, but he didn't buy it either. The kid was hiding something. And when Caleb glanced around the cabin, eyes lingering too long on the fireplace, Ethan's gut tightened. Scout stood again, tail stiff, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Caleb looked at the dog nervously. "He's protective," Ethan said evenly. "Don't take it personal." Caleb nodded quickly, staring into the fire. The wind battered the walls again, and the cabin trembled. Ethan leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "You said your truck's near the ridge. What brings you up here in the middle of winter?" Caleb hesitated, then sighed. "Work. I was supposed to meet someone from a survey crew. They said the job was mining-related, just soil testing. But when I got there, the site was empty. No one showed." Ethan felt the words land like a weight. "Mining company?" "Yeah," Caleb said quietly. "Silver Ridge Minerals." The room went silent, except for the fire crackling. Scout's ears flicked. Ethan stared at the young man, realizing this wasn't random. "You sure that's who hired you?" Caleb nodded. "They wired the payment up front. Guess I should have seen that as a red flag." Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't know if Caleb was lying or being used. But one thing was certain. He hadn't just stumbled into this storm. Someone had sent him here. Maybe as bait. Maybe as a witness. Outside, the wind shifted. The kind of shift that tells you something else is moving beneath it. Scout went to the window, barking once, sharp. Ethan looked through the glass and saw faint headlights cutting across the snow far down the ridge, flickering, then disappearing. He turned back to Caleb. "You're staying put tonight. Doors locked till morning." Caleb looked uneasy, but nodded. "Understood." Ethan rechecked the locks, set his rifle by the chair, and sat across from the fire. The storm raged on, white swallowing black, until the world outside ceased to exist. Inside, the only sound was the fire's whisper, and the faint clink of metal when Caleb shifted his coat, something small glinting beneath the fabric. Ethan saw it, but said nothing. The storm would bury their tracks tonight. But come morning, he'd find out who this young man really was, and why Silver Ridge kept sending ghosts to his door. By morning, the storm had thinned to a whisper, leaving behind a world glazed in ice. The pines around Raven's Ridge bowed under frost, and the air was heavy with the stillness that comes after something violent. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his cabin, his breath fogging in the brittle air, staring down the valley road that cut like a pale scar through the snow. Inside, Scout rested by the hearth, watching Ethan with his usual calm, but his ears flicked with every sound outside. An instinct that had saved both their lives more than once. Caleb Wright was still asleep on the cot by the window, his coat pulled tight around him. The young man had barely said a word after dawn, and Ethan wasn't sure if that was guilt, exhaustion, or fear. Ethan poured coffee into a metal thermos, slung his rifle across his back, and looked down at Scout. "Stay here. Watch him." The dog tilted his head but didn't move. "I mean it," Ethan added. He gave the shepherd a final pat before stepping into the cold. The drive into town was slow, the truck tires crunching over frozen gravel. The road wound along the edge of the forest, narrow and slick. The storm had stripped everything to shades of white and gray. Ethan kept one hand near the pistol holstered under his jacket. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following, though the mirror showed nothing but emptiness. By the time he reached the small town of Clearwater, the sun hung weakly over the rooftops, painting the snow in a faint amber glow. The streets were quiet, lined with single-story buildings, and the occasional pickup parked outside diners still shuttered for the morning. He parked near the library, a squat, red brick building with frosted windows and a sagging flagpole that creaked in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of paper, dust, and old heat. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with wire-frame glasses and a sweater the color of oatmeal, gave him a polite nod. "Morning," she said, her voice soft. Her name tag read Linda in neat black letters. She looked to be in her mid-40s, with tired eyes but a kind face, someone who'd seen every kind of stranger pass through without asking too many questions. "Morning," Ethan replied, removing his gloves. "Mind if I use one of your computers?" "Help yourself. Internet's slow, but it works." Ethan found a corner desk, the furthest from the counter, and logged on. The computer hummed to life, screen flickering with age. He slipped a small flash drive from his pocket, the one holding scanned copies of Arthur Mason's notebook, the map, and photos of the chemical vials. The real materials remained hidden back at the cabin, buried beneath the floor. He opened his email draft, encrypted with a layered code system he'd used back in his service days when sending classified field reports. The recipient was Ryan Cooper, a name he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Ryan had been a war correspondent during the Hotsob Kandahar years, Ethan's last deployment. He was in his late 30s now, sharp-eyed and relentless, a man who had seen more truth than comfort. Back then, Ryan was tall, athletic, with a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow and a knack for making friends in places where silence usually reigned. His reports from Afghanistan had earned him both awards and enemies. After Ethan's injury, Ryan had left the front lines and moved into investigative journalism, specializing in corporate corruption and political cover-ups. If there was anyone Ethan trusted with the truth, it was him. Ethan typed slowly, carefully. To CooperIndependentPost.com, subject, Winter Cargo. Attached are files related to an environmental investigation by Arthur Mason, deceased 2008. The materials suggest large-scale contamination linked to Silver Ridge Minerals, now Blackwell Resources. Keep this encrypted. If I fail to contact you by 8:06 a.m. tomorrow, forward everything to your federal contact list, FBI Environmental Crimes Division, case tag Bitterroot. E. Cole. He paused, then added one last line. Trust no one wearing a badge or a suit. He clicked Send. The progress bar crawled painfully slow before finally confirming transmission. He deleted all traces from the system, wiped the drive, and pocketed it. When he turned, he found Linda watching him from the counter. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, forcing a faint smile. "Just catching up with an old friend?" Linda nodded, then lowered her voice. "You be careful driving back up that ridge, Mr. Cole." "Well, Mr. Cole, Sheriff Rigby's been around asking questions about that property you bought. Something about old land deeds." Ethan's pulse quickened. "That so?" "Stopped by just yesterday," she continued. "Said there'd been some vandalism near the ridge. Wanted to make sure no one new had moved in." Ethan gave a curt nod. "Appreciate the heads up." He left without another word. Outside, the sky had darkened again, thick clouds rolling over the peaks like bruises. He climbed into the truck, scanning the street. Near the far corner, a black sedan idled with its engine running, windows tinted. The driver's silhouette was visible only for a moment before the vehicle pulled away. Ethan watched it go, jaw tightening. The drive back to the cabin was tense. The snow began to fall again, soft but steady. The forest swallowed the light as he climbed higher. He parked halfway up the trail, cutting the engine, and sat for a full minute listening. Nothing but the soft hiss of snow. He walked the rest of the way on foot, rifle slung low, boots muffled by the powder. When the cabin came into view, smoke still rose from the chimney. Scout met him halfway, tail wagging once, then stiffening as he sniffed the air. His ears flicked toward the woods. Ethan crouched, whispering, "What is it, boy?" The dog gave a low, warning growl. Inside, Caleb sat near the fire, flipping through a tattered field manual. His eyes darted up as Ethan entered. "Everything okay?" he asked. "For now," Ethan said. He shook snow from his jacket and poured 2 cups of coffee. "You sleep well?" "Better than outside," Caleb replied. He looked uneasy, as if trying to read Ethan's mood. Ethan sat across from him. "You mentioned working for Silver Ridge Minerals. You ever meet Henry Blackwell?" Caleb hesitated. "Only once. He came to the site last month, showed up in a black SUV with a security detail, gave a speech about rebuilding Montana's economy. The crew didn't buy it. 2 guys quit that day." "You think they were hiding something?" Caleb nodded. "We kept hitting old tunnels that weren't on any survey maps. My supervisor said to fill them back in and forget about them." Ethan leaned forward. "You remember the name of that supervisor?" Caleb's lips tightened. "Yeah, a man named Rigby." Ethan froze. "As in Sheriff Rigby?" "The same. Everyone called him Chief. Said he handled permits." That was enough to confirm what Ethan already feared. The sheriff wasn't just a local cop. He was part of the cover-up. The contamination, the buried tunnels, the missing journalist, it all tied together under Blackwell's company. He stood, pacing. "Listen carefully. I sent copies of Mason's work to a friend in the press. If something happens to me tonight, the story goes public." Caleb looked alarmed. "You think they'll come after you?" Ethan glanced at the window, where the wind pressed snow against the glass. "I don't think, son." "I know." He went to the table and pulled a worn notepad from his pocket, jotting down a set of coordinates. "If things go sideways, head south along the ridge till you reach Highway 93. There's a ranger station, old and empty. Wait there until daylight." Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. "What about you?" "I'll buy us time." That night, the snow thickened again, swallowing the trees in silence. Ethan sat by the fire with Scout at his feet, checking his watch every hour. 6:00 a.m. That was the line. If he was still breathing by then, he'd call Ryan and tell him to hold the story. If not, the truth would finally see light. Scout's head lifted suddenly, ears pricked. A faint sound, engines, distant but approaching, from the road below. Ethan extinguished the lamp and reached for the rifle. He looked at Caleb. "Lights out, now." The young man obeyed instantly. Outside, the forest waited, white, still, and full of unseen eyes. The night came down like a curtain of iron, thick with snow that swallowed sound and light alike. Ethan Cole sat near the darkened window, his rifle across his knees, watching the faint orange glow of the dying fire. Every few seconds, he glanced at his watch, 02:13 a.m. The storm outside had slowed to a whisper, the kind of deceptive calm that precedes an ambush. Scout lay near the door, motionless but alert, his gray and tan fur rising and falling with quiet breaths. Every once in a while, his ears flicked toward the forest, his gaze sharp, tracking something unseen. Caleb Wright sat by the table, pale and tense. The young man had tried to stay calm, but his leg bounced nervously under the chair. Ethan could tell the kid wasn't built for this kind of night. The waiting, the silence, the invisible edge of danger. "You're sure you saw headlights?" Ethan asked quietly. Caleb nodded. "Yeah, 2 cars, maybe 3. I only caught them for a second before they shut them off." Ethan didn't curse or flinch. He'd expected this. "Then we don't have much time." He stood, crossing to the front door, testing the lock once more. It would hold for maybe a minute under pressure. 2, if luck decided to show mercy. He moved quickly, dragging the table across the room and tilting it on its side against the front entrance. He took the 2 chairs, stacked them beneath the back window, and pulled an old dresser in front of the side door. Every sound echoed in the tight wooden cabin, each scrape of furniture a reminder that this was all temporary. Caleb rose, eyes wide. "You think they'll actually try to—" Ethan cut him off. "They're not coming to talk, kid." He looked him square in the eye. "You armed?" Caleb hesitated before pulling a small revolver from inside his jacket. "Found it in my truck before it broke down. Only got 4 bullets." Ethan nodded once. "Keep it. Aim low, aim steady. If they get in, you don't hesitate." The younger man swallowed hard but nodded. Scout suddenly growled, a low, vibrating sound that rumbled through the room. His body went rigid, fur standing like static. Ethan moved to the window and peeked through the narrow slit between the boards. At first he saw nothing but the gray wash of snow. Then, movement. Shadows moving across the clearing, coordinated, careful. He whispered, 3 men, maybe 4. Caleb's face drained of color. "What do we do?" Ethan's voice dropped to a calm whisper that didn't match the tension in the room. "We make them work for it." He handed Caleb a lantern. "Kill it the second I say." Scout barked once, sharp, urgent. The signal came next, a faint crunch of boots circling toward the rear. Ethan moved fast, motioning to Caleb to take the left wall while he aimed toward the back door. The first impact hit like thunder, a body slamming into the wood. The door held. Then came the sound of breaking glass. The side window shattered, inward, spraying shards across the floor. "Lantern, off!" Ethan hissed. Caleb killed the light, plunging the cabin into total darkness. The only illumination came from the faint coals in the fireplace. Ethan fired one shot toward the window. The muzzle flash lit the room for a heartbeat, and in that flicker he saw a figure dive to the ground outside, snow exploding around him. Scout lunged toward the sound, barking furiously. Ethan's pulse stayed steady, every motion precise, every sense sharpened by years of survival training. Then came the smell, a sharp, oily tang that cut through the smoke of gunpowder. Kerosene. Ethan's eyes widened. "Down!" he barked. A glass bottle shattered through the front window, igniting in a burst of flame as it hit the floor. The fire spread fast, orange tongues racing up the wooden walls. Another bottle followed, then another, the air filled with thick black smoke. Caleb coughed, stumbling back. "They're burning us out," he shouted. Ethan grabbed him by the collar and yanked him toward the floor. "Stay low, move!" Scout barked again, circling between them, his eyes reflecting the firelight. The room was turning into a furnace. Flames licked across the ceiling, smoke clawed down from above. The wooden beams groaned under the sudden heat. Ethan dragged Caleb toward the back, where the dresser blocked the service door. He kicked it aside, coughing. "Cover your face," he ordered. Caleb wrapped his arm over his mouth and followed. Ethan shoved the door open, cold air rushing in like salvation. Outside, snow whipped against their faces, the contrast between freezing wind and infernal heat making the world spin. Scout bolted through first, barking wildly into the night. Ethan grabbed Caleb's shoulder, pushing him forward, then turned back just long enough to see the fire consume the cabin he'd tried to make a home. They stumbled into the snowdrift, gasping for air. Ethan scanned the tree line. Movement flickered on the edge of vision. Men, dark shapes emerging from the white, armed and advancing. At the center of them, one figure stood out, taller, composed, coat immaculate despite the storm. Henry Blackwell. Even in the chaos, he looked untouched, like a man watching the inevitable. His silver hair gleamed under the reflected firelight, his gloved hand steady on the pistol he held. "Mr. Cole," he called out, his voice carrying unnaturally well across the storm. "I warned you about digging." Ethan raised his rifle. "And I warned you about coming back." Blackwell smiled faintly. "You're a soldier, Mr. Cole. You know how this ends?" He motioned to his men. "Finish it." Gunfire cracked through the blizzard. Ethan dove into the snow, rolling behind a fallen tree, returning 2 quick shots. Scout sprinted into the open, circling wide before lunging at one of the attackers. The man screamed, firing wildly before collapsing as Scout tore into his arm. The snow turned dark, where he fell. Ethan shouted, "Scout, back!" The dog obeyed, retreating to cover, muzzle streaked with frost and blood. Caleb fired twice, his shots wild but enough to drive the others behind cover. The wind screamed louder, carrying smoke and sparks from the burning cabin into the trees. Blackwell advanced slowly, unhurried, like a man walking through his own design. He aimed deliberately and fired. The bullet hit the snow inches from Ethan's arm, sending white powder exploding into the air. "Last chance, Cole!" Blackwell shouted. "Walk away and leave the evidence buried." Ethan's reply came low and hard. "It's already gone, Henry. Sent it this morning." For the first time, the mask slipped. Blackwell's expression froze, fury replacing his calm. "You fool," he hissed. "You have no idea who you're playing against." "Doesn't matter," Ethan said, rising slightly to fire again. "You'll burn just like your lies." Another burst of gunfire followed, deafening in the confined clearing. Caleb ducked behind a snowbank, shouting over the chaos. "We can't stay here." Ethan fired one more round and then turned to him. "Head for the ridge, move!" The 2 men sprinted into the trees, Scout bounding ahead to clear the path. Behind them, the cabin collapsed inward, sending a column of sparks into the sky. The firelight flickered against Blackwell's figure as he watched them disappear into the storm, the flames painting his face in alternating shades of rage and triumph. Ethan didn't stop until the world behind them turned black again. He dropped to one knee, lungs burning, steam rising from his coat. Scout stood guard beside him, ears forward, breath heavy. Caleb collapsed in the snow, gasping. Ethan looked back toward the distant glow on the ridge, the remains of everything he'd built turned to ash. He whispered, "They're not done yet." Scout nudged his arm with a cold nose, a silent promise of loyalty in a world that had just gone up in flames. And somewhere behind them, through the hiss of falling snow, came the faint echo of Blackwell's voice, carried on the wind. You can't hide from the fire, Cole. It always finds you. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving the sky bruised and pale above the mountains. The wind had finally died, and in its wake came a silence so complete that even the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Ethan Cole crouched behind a ridge of frozen earth, his rifle laid across his knees, eyes fixed on the clearing below. The fire had devoured his cabin entirely. Only a blackened chimney and a smoldering outline of what used to be his home remained. Beside him, Scout stood alert, his breath forming steady plumes in the frigid air. A thin streak of blood marked the shepherd's shoulder, dried and dark, but his eyes stayed sharp, refusing rest. A few feet away, Caleb Wright leaned against a pine trunk, shivering inside his torn coat. The young man looked hollow-eyed, haunted by the night before. The frost clung to his blonde hair and eyelashes, turning him ghost-like in the pale light. "You think they're gone?" he whispered. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He watched the smoke curling upward, the color shifting from gray to the first hints of orange as daylight spread across the ridge. "No," he said at last. "Men like Blackwell don't run. They regroup." Caleb swallowed hard. "Then what now?" Ethan exhaled, slow and steady. "Now, we end it." He reached into his coat and pulled out the small radio transmitter, an old field model, dented and scratched but reliable. Ryan Cooper had given it to him years ago before their last mission overseas. It ran on a single lithium battery and transmitted on an encrypted frequency reserved for emergency law enforcement communication. Ethan tuned the dial, his gloved fingers moving with muscle memory, and pressed the call button. "Agent Field Frequency 874. This is Ethan Cole, retired U.S. Army. Priority emergency. Coordinates north of Clearwater Ridge, Sector C-19. Corporate sabotage, arson, and ongoing armed assault involving Silver Ridge Minerals. Evidence of environmental crimes. Requesting immediate federal response." Static answered first, then a voice crackled through. "This is Agent Lisa Monroe, FBI Billings Field Office. Identify yourself again, sir." Ethan repeated the information. There was a pause, followed by a sharper tone. "Copy that. We've had reports of explosions near the ridge. Units are in motion, ETA 25 minutes. Hold your position and avoid contact." "Too late for that," Ethan said grimly. "They're already here." Monroe's voice came steadier now. "Then stay alive until we get there." He clipped the radio to his belt and turned to Caleb. "You hear that? Help's coming. But when they land, I need them to see the truth with their own eyes." Caleb frowned. "What truth?" Ethan pointed down toward the remains of the cabin. "The proof. Mason's evidence isn't gone. It's under the chimney base. I buried the originals there before the fire reached it." Caleb's eyes widened. "You're going back. Down there?" Ethan nodded once. "If that's what it takes." He looked at Scout, who stood ready, tail low, muscles tight. "You with me, boy?" Scout answered with a short bark, steady, fearless. They began the descent carefully, weaving between charred trees and snowdrifts. The air stank of smoke and ash, and the ground still radiated warmth in places where the fire had fed on resin-rich pine. As they reached the clearing, the remnants of the cabin loomed like the skeleton of a fallen beast. Then came the sound. Engines. Not from the forest this time, but from above. A deep, rhythmic thump rolled through the air, echoing across the valley. Caleb looked up. "Helicopter," he breathed. The sound grew louder until the first rotorcraft broke through the clouds, dark against the rising sun. Its side bore the white letters FBI, followed by a second helicopter marked Montana State Police. Spotlights cut through the smoke, sweeping over the clearing. Ethan raised an arm and signaled. The beam caught him, holding steady. A voice boomed over the loudspeaker. "Federal agents, Drop any weapons and identify yourself." Ethan slung his rifle behind his shoulder and shouted over the wind. "Ethan Cole, former Army! The evidence is here, under the chimney foundation." Before he could finish, gunfire cracked from the tree line. Scout barked furiously, spinning toward the sound. Blackwell's remaining men, 3 of them, emerged from cover, firing blindly at the helicopters. Bullets chewed through snow and shattered branches. The agents responded instantly. One helicopter swung wide while the other hovered low, side doors sliding open as tactical officers took aim. Caleb hit the ground beside Ethan, shouting, "They're still fighting!" "Stay down!" Ethan roared, covering him as he crawled toward the old chimney. Bullets whined overhead. Scout bolted ahead, teeth bared, chasing one of the fleeing men into the trees. The chaos was quick and sharp, then ended just as suddenly. A voice shouted from above, "Suspects down! Area secure!" Ethan pushed himself up, coughing through the smoke. The second helicopter lowered further, its landing skids sinking into the snow. From it stepped Agent Lisa Monroe, tall and commanding, her black tactical jacket marked with bright yellow FBI lettering. She looked to be in her late 30s, sharp-featured with dark brown hair tied back in a tight braid. Her eyes were green-gray, steady, decisive, the kind of gaze that measured a man before he spoke. She approached Ethan through the wind, flanked by 2 armed officers. "You the one who made the call?" "That's right," Ethan said, handing over his ID. Monroe glanced at it, then at him. "You're lucky we caught the signal. The ridge blocked half your transmission." "I figured." He gestured toward the collapsed chimney. "The evidence Mason collected. It's under there. Everything Blackwell's people buried. Samples, documents, maps. It proves Silver Ridge has been dumping chemicals into Bitterroot Creek for years." Monroe nodded to her team. "Start digging." 2 agents with spades and thermal gear moved to the chimney remains. A few moments later, one called out, "Got something." They hauled up a half-melted steel box, scorched but intact. Monroe knelt beside it, snapping the latch open. Inside lay sealed containers labeled with biohazard markings, and beneath them, waterproof envelopes stamped with Arthur Mason's initials. She looked up at Ethan. "You just handed us a 15-year case, Mr. Cole." Ethan exhaled for what felt like the first time in days. "Took long enough." From behind, a voice groaned. "You'll regret that." Everyone turned. 2 state troopers dragged a figure from the tree line. Henry Blackwell, his immaculate coat now torn and blackened, his silver hair disheveled, one eye swollen shut. Even defeated, he carried himself with the arrogance of a man used to control. His wrists were bound, but his expression was unbroken. Monroe's gaze hardened. "Henry Blackwell, you're under arrest for arson, conspiracy, and violation of federal environmental laws." Blackwell smirked faintly. "You really think this ends with me, Agent?" Monroe replied coldly. "It ends with the truth." She turned to the troopers. "Get him out of my sight." As they hauled him toward the helicopter, Blackwell locked eyes with Ethan. "You're a soldier without a war, Cole. Men like you always find another enemy. Pray it's not yourself." Ethan didn't respond. He simply watched as Blackwell disappeared into the chopper, his words scattering into the wind. Monroe approached him again. "You should get checked by the medics. You've been through hell." Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. There's one thing left." He knelt beside the burned snow, retrieving Scout's collar tag that had come loose during the fight. He slipped it back into place. He earned it. Monroe allowed herself a faint smile. "Good dog." Ethan stood, watching as the helicopters lifted off, their rotors stirring the snow into swirling halos of light. The sky above had finally cleared, a vast stretch of blue breaking through the clouds. For the first time since buying the cabin, Ethan felt the weight lift from his chest. He looked down at Scout, who pressed against his leg, eyes bright and steady. "Let's go home," he murmured, though they both knew they'd have to build it again from the ground up. Behind them, the last flames died, and in the morning, the headlines would tell the rest. 15-year environmental conspiracy exposed in Montana, Silver Ridge CEO arrested. But for Ethan Cole, it wasn't justice that mattered. It was peace. Something no storm, no fire, and no man could ever take again. The last of the snow was gone by mid-March, leaving the mountains raw and glistening under the pale Montana sun. The world smelled of thaw, wet pine, damp earth, and smoke carried from distant cabins preparing for spring. Ethan Cole stood on the ridge overlooking what used to be his home. The ground was bare now, softening after months of ice, and the black scar where his cabin once stood had begun to fade beneath sprouting green moss. The chimney still remained, a column of stone reaching upward like a stubborn memory that refused to crumble. Beside him, Scout trotted ahead, tail wagging lazily, his sable-gray fur shimmering with health. The 7-year-old shepherd had healed well. Only a faint line of scar ran along his shoulder where the fire had burned close. He stopped, sniffed the ground, and looked back at Ethan with bright amber eyes that seemed to ask, "Do we start again?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, boy. We start again." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a calm that hadn't touched this valley in months. For the first time in what felt like years, Ethan wasn't listening for footsteps or engines. The silence meant peace now, not danger. He took off his gloves and crouched beside the chimney's base, brushing his hand against the stones. "Funny," he murmured. "You burned everything else but stayed standing." Scout sat beside him, pressing his body against Ethan's leg. The dog's warmth was grounding, steady and familiar. Together they watched the smoke of a new fire curl from the makeshift camp Ethan had built near the stream. He'd been back for 2 days already, camping in a tent, rebuilding bit by bit. The FBI and state police had finished their cleanup weeks ago, hauling away the remnants of Blackwell's empire and freezing every one of his corporate accounts. The newspapers called it the Bitterroot Revelation. The headlines painted Ethan as the lone veteran who uncovered the truth behind a 15-year cover-up. To the rest of the country, it was a story of courage. But to Ethan, it was survival. Nothing more. He looked up as the distant sound of tires crunching gravel reached his ears. A gray Jeep wound its way up the ridge trail, sunlight glinting off the windshield. Scout perked his ears, but his tail wagged slowly, recognizing the sound before Ethan did. The vehicle came to a stop a few yards away, and a man stepped out, his boots sinking slightly into the thawed mud. He was in his late 30s, tall, with weathered skin that hinted at long hours under harsh skies. His brown hair was short and swept back, and a light stubble shadowed his jaw. His eyes, clear, determined blue, held the same spark Ethan remembered from the desert years ago. "Ryan Cooper," Ethan said, standing to meet him. Ryan grinned and spread his arms. "You look better than the last photo they ran of you, old man." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, well, firelight's not exactly flattering." They shook hands firmly. Ryan glanced around the clearing, his journalist's gaze scanning every detail. "Hard to believe this was the center of it all," he said. "The Bureau's still digging through the files you sent. Turns out Mason's story was just the tip of the iceberg. Blackwell's network reached across 3 states. Ethan nodded. He'll spend the rest of his life explaining that network to a federal judge. Ryan chuckled, then crouched to pat Scout, who leaned into the touch with a soft huff. "And this guy? Still sharp as ever?" "The sharpest," Ethan said. "He heard them before I ever did." Ryan smiled, scratching Scout's neck. They're calling you both heroes, you know. Local news won't shut up about the veteran and his dog who uncovered the conspiracy in the mountains. Ethan looked toward the horizon, where the peaks met the melting snow. I'm no hero, Ryan. He reached down, resting a hand on Scout's head. He is. He knew when to bark and when to stay quiet. Sometimes I think he saw the truth before any of us did. Ryan stood again, his expression softening. You always did let the dog take the credit. Ethan grinned. He earns it. For a while, they stood in silence. The air carried the sound of dripping water from the melting icicles, a rhythm that matched the slow return of life to the valley. Ryan finally broke the quiet. So what now? You gonna rebuild? Ethan took a deep breath, looking over the land. The trees still bore scorch marks, but new shoots were already pushing through the ash. Yeah, I'll rebuild. Smaller this time, stronger foundation. Ryan nodded approvingly. You staying up here? For a while, Ethan said. This place deserves to breathe again. Mason's story deserves to end here too. Ryan's tone softened. You know, not everyone would have done what you did. Most men would have taken the money, walked away, never looked back. Ethan's jaw tightened briefly. I've walked away enough times in my life. This time I stayed. Ryan looked at him for a moment, then said quietly, I'm glad you did. He glanced at his watch. I have to get back to Helena for a briefing, but they wanted me to give you this. He reached into his jacket and handed Ethan a folded envelope, sealed with the FBI insignia. Ethan frowned, breaking the seal. Inside was a single letter, an official commendation from the Department of Justice, recognizing him for extraordinary civilian bravery in the exposure of federal corruption and environmental crime. At the bottom, in pen, was a handwritten note from Agent Lisa Monroe. Some wars end quietly. Thank you for fighting one that mattered. Ethan folded the letter and slipped it into his jacket. Tell Monroe I appreciate it, but next time, maybe they can frame it in something other than bureaucracy. Ryan laughed. You haven't changed a bit. He turned toward his jeep but paused halfway. You sure you'll be okay out here? Ethan nodded. Better than anywhere else? Ryan smiled one last time. All right, old soldier. Don't let the ghosts get too loud. Ethan watched as the jeep disappeared down the trail, dust rising where snow once lay. The wind carried the faint hum of the engine until it faded entirely, leaving only the soft gurgle of the creek nearby. He walked back to the chimney and sat down beside Scout. The sun had climbed higher now, painting the valley in gold. You hear that, boy? Ethan said quietly. No more sirens, no more gunfire, just us. Scout laid his head on Ethan's boot, eyes half closed, the picture of peace. Ethan took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. For years he had lived by the rule of survival. React, adapt, endure. But now, for the first time, he felt the stir of something new. Rebuilding. Redemption didn't come with medals or applause. It came with silence, with the sound of wood being cut, nails driven, walls rising again. As the day stretched on, Ethan began laying the first beams of a new cabin. Scout followed him back and forth, watching with curious eyes as each plank took shape. The smell of sawdust mixed with spring air. Somewhere in the trees, a hawk cried. A clear, lonely sound carried far above the peaks. When the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Ethan stopped and looked around. Half a wall stood, crooked but real. He smiled faintly. It's a start, he said. Scout barked once, as if in agreement. Ethan gazed at the mountains glowing orange in the last light of day. The valley that had once hidden corruption now stood open, honest, and whole again. The secrets buried beneath its soil had turned to truth, and from that truth, something living had begun to grow. He reached down to ruffle Scout's fur. "Come on, partner," he said softly. "Let's build us a new story." And as they turned toward the half-built cabin, the wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, the smell of beginnings. Sometimes, miracles don't come with thunder or light. They come quietly, through loyalty, courage, and faith. Ethan thought he came to that cabin to escape the world, but maybe God brought him there to find what was never lost: hope. The same way He leads us through our darkest nights, He also sends us companions to remind us we're never truly alone. Sometimes that companion walks on 2 legs, sometimes on 4. So if you believe that love, loyalty, and faith can heal even the coldest winters of the soul, share this story. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and let's keep the spirit of kindness alive across this community. Subscribe to Paws Kingdom for more stories of courage, miracles, and second chances. And tonight, as you close your eyes, say a small prayer. Lord, bless those who walk alone and those loyal hearts who walk beside them.